Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated I Always Want to Die Sometimes by the 1975. We're going to go over some topics like arranging string sections, weird sound design elements, the interesting chord choices of the guitars, songwriting ideas behind their chord choices, and a lot more. But before we jump into that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I produce music under the name Velvet Year. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to create their own pop music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you enjoyed this video and you think we would have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description. Now on to the video. Also, if you guys hear any rattling during the video, it's probably because I have a new tattoo here and it is still covered up. So let's start with the guitars. So these are just some basic double-tracked acoustics, and really I would say a majority of the song is built around this specific kind of guitar playing. It's very Oasis inspired, like very Morning Glory-esque Oasis. So in the intro and verses, we have this sort of like descending line that is kind of pedaling on that low E string while the upper chord voicings are moving down. And the transition that really seals the deal in terms of the tone of the song are these guys. So we go from an A major to an A minor, which is a really fun chord progression to use when you want to invoke that kind of melancholy feel. And in this section, we're sort of pedaling on that low E. Whereas after that, in this section, we're going to more, I would say, fuller chords. And they have a very interesting flavor because in that intro section, we're really settled on the 1. But here in this part of the track, we're really focused on the 2, which is an F sharp major 7. And then to sort of act as the transition again, going back to that sort of E pedaling voice, we do that A major, A minor thing again. The song is a great example of how if you're going to go from two very drastic moods, it can help to have sort of a transition point between the two of them. In terms of mixing, these guys are pretty standard acoustics recorded with the pencil condenser and my Yamaha. Each one of them have a little bit of R comp on it with some EQ and Kramer tape and some utility for automation in certain sections. Because as you can see, when they actually get to the chorus, the electric guitars below actually kind of take up the role of these guys. So in order for things to not feel pretty dense from a mix standpoint, we need to lower the acoustics so that the electrics can kind of take up that space. Which, speaking of the electrics, these guys have like my favorite part of the song, which is this sort of like leading into it. That's really the fill that transitions into the full band vibe that's present in the chorus and this really distorted lead line. I don't know, it's my favorite part of the song. So we really have two parts here, this double track part below, which is just the acoustic or the chords that the acoustic is playing, but they're played on a Jazzmaster. Very bright, very jangly. I feel like you need a Jazzmaster for this one. I tried it with all of my guitars, and the only way I was able to get that tone was with a Jazzmaster. I did not use a preset for this one. I'm trying to get more into building out a tone pack right now, and this is one of the songs that was suggested for that tone pack, so I started some of the early divings of it. But we're just going into a Marshall with the amp, gain turned down a bit, bass boosted, treble really cut. These guys aren't being used at all, so it's literally just this amp. Going into some EQ and some compression, and then on these rhythms, just a tiny bit of chorus from Tal. We don't want them to be as thick as that other electric part. We just want them to be a little bit spicy, and then some EQ for shaping the high end, really. It was kind of harsh. And so when these rhythms come in, they're meant to sort of be like the upped version of those acoustics that just kind of like slap you in the face a bit more. They're not gentle. Like if I just solo that transition between the acoustics and these electrics, you can really hear how it sort of slaps you through that transition. And then another thing that really adds to the sort of distortion pedal kick on vibe is this lead line. And part of it is the processing of it, using a tube screamer into a Saldano style amp with a little bit of choral post amp going into the EQ and the compression, and then some Tal chorus after it, but it's turned up a bit more, so it's pretty wavy and then carved out a lot more. At the beginning is when it's actually playing this lead line, but then as it gets farther over here, it's actually doing more of an extension versus... It's just meant to be like weird, squashed, and distorted. Bring out sort of like the grungier vibe of the track. All these guys and the acoustics and most elements in this track are going to a little bit of Valhalla Vintage Verb on this default preset, but I adjust the EQ and the decay a bit. Normally I find the low cut, especially if you're running like low end elements into it, you need to sort of shape it a bit more, and the high cut. Underneath those guys, we have our bass. Very simple, very light. Something interesting that I didn't realize about this bass part until I actually had to replicate it was that in the chorus, it's pretty high up on the neck, but only for certain notes. Like, goes lower there. Higher. Lower. Low. Higher. Like, it's just very interesting how they're like choosing the ranges of those notes. Like, it's not all just as low as it can possibly be. A lot of times there is like a lower root for some of these notes that are higher, but they're choosing that higher note just to give it more of like a vintage vibe. Now, having said that, in order for it to work in the mix, you need a tone that has enough low end even when you are playing those higher notes. Otherwise, you're just going to not feel like you're playing bass. So we're just using some Plug-in Alliance Ampeg SVT VR Classic, going into some compression and some CLA bass. Normally, I like it on growl and just let the sub fill it up a bit more. I'm actually normally cutting high end with this. Very rarely am I boosting high end with it. Some sidechain compression, a little bit of bass rider. I like the stage friendly preset. It tends to tame stuff out a little bit more. And then some sidechain compression and EQ. The bass is going to the reverb send, but I find that you need to be careful with how much you're sending to it, because if you don't send any to the send, it just sounds like the bass is not actually in the track. But then if you send too much of it, it sort of washes out the low end in a very unpleasant way. So this is the one that you have to find the balance with the most. Underneath that, we have the drums. A majority of the sound is coming from this Steven Slate instance. I actually went through and made sort of like a custom kit for this song. So if there was like an element that I felt wasn't really accurate to how the original song sounded, I would just kind of go through their libraries and just sort of find ones that I thought sounded similar and then replace them with that, which was fun because I already had the MIDI set up. So I was just able to sort of like drag and drop it onto this, and it was very convenient. I am mapping my summed kicks and my summed snares out to different sends in Ableton. So this audio 12 is actually the kick drum and this audio 13 is the snare. So if I just solo those. And I just like doing that whenever I'm using Steven Slate stuff, just because I like processing my mix dynamically off of the kick and the snare normally. And it's just kind of hard when the tracks are inside of the plugin. So instead of rendering stuff out or anything like that, I normally just route out those channels on the Slate mixer into audio channels in Ableton. So here on the kick, I was able to do a little bit of transient shaping, some general EQ, and some max bass to give it a little bit more low end, which would have completely messed up the rest of the kit had I just put it on the instance of Slate drums. And then with the snare, I just did some surgical EQ to get a little bit of that ring out because it was pretty aggressive. And I was happy with how the hi-hats sounded in this kit, but I felt like the more I listened to the original song, it felt like there was like a loop of hi-hats on top of this intro section and that they weren't actually like playing the real hi-hats. I don't know if that's just me, but it just felt like the hi-hats were not real hi-hats, or maybe it was like the rim is not a real rim. There's like a sample in there somewhere. So I just chose the hi-hats, and so this is just a loop with a little bit of transient shaping on it. From an arrangement standpoint, these drums are very simple and effective. So in this intro section, we just have this sort of like faster, like chugging motion. So the hi-hat is playing eighth notes, but because that snare has this sort of longer relationship with the kick drum, it's not just a 4-bar loop, it's a boom, boom, ka, boom, ka. It makes that beat feel less like it's this like in your face like eighth note thing, which is nice because even though the drummer is playing the fastest here than he is in the rest of the song, it still feels very gentle. And then we have this transition section where he moves to the open hi-hat. And he also moves from the rim to the snare. Something important to notice is he's actually playing the exact same thing here. He's just changing what he's playing it on. Like his rim is now a snare, and his power hand, which is the hand that's predominantly keeping time, has moved from a really fast eighth note hi-hat to an open quarter note hi-hat. It's also when we bring in a tiny bit of tambourine, because you can never have too much tambourine. And then this section is short-lived before the power hand moves to the ride. So here you just listen. Hi-hat, fill, ride. Also, I never really used the tambourine inside of slate drums that often, but for this one, I just felt like that other tambourine needed a little bit more boost, so we have that tambourine playing as well. But you can hear how this guy is actually faster from a meter standpoint. This section actually feels more in your face, more high energy, but it's actually slowed down a bit if you don't count the tambourines as hi-hats. All these guys just have a little bit of processing on them. Going into some Kramer tape again. Something else that I thought was really interesting is these sort of like subtle sound design layers. These aren't exactly the same to the original track, but there are similar-ish layers in this song and that same 1975 album and a bunch of 1975 albums. Just super weird ambient things. These are actually samples that I made. So I just took a recording of me sort of playing with my Jazz Master and I bounced that performance down. And then I brought it back into Ableton and I messed around with some parameters on this bit crusher delay thing. And I literally just mapped it to some knobs on my MPC over here and just messed around with it. And I performed a sound design session essentially. And then after I did that for like 20 minutes, I just sort of went through and found these longer takes of bits that I thought were cool. And then I have them saved over in Ableton as like these sound design elements in a folder that I can just drag and drop real quick. Yeah, if you want to get that 1975 sound, stuff like this is like the spicy stuff on top, like the last 10% that really pushes it over the edge. And then the part that took the longest, the string section. So this isn't like a full orchestra. I just decided I was going to do something very simple. So we're just using the orchestral stuff from the new Contact 7 line. So we have a cello, 2 violas, 2 violins, just to sort of spread out the range. Cello is mainly playing the chords voiced as fifths. Something that's really important to getting these strings to sound right is how you are voicing your chords. So as you can see, some of these notes are holding out longer than others, and that's because I'm using inversions to keep them kind of in the same range this whole time. So for example, if I just took my regular chord shapes and just copy and pasted them over and over again so that the root is on the bottom and just move them around, it would sound something like this. Like, it just feels like this MIDI shape that's being moved up and down a scale versus what we actually did for the track. It just feels more realistic. And if you don't really take the time to arrange your MIDI correctly, it's kind of really hard to make a string plugin sound realistic. It's just kind of intrinsic. If you're playing something that a string player would never play in terms of your note choice, there isn't really anything you can do. I did use the mod wheel for all of these just to sort of control their velocities a bit, make them bump up a little bit more in this section and come down for this intro and outro. Another thing is I actually performed all of these takes live. So if you look here, the MIDI is not perfectly on top of each other for any of these notes. They're actually pretty scattered, which is another great way to replicate a live string sound. But after that, we have the violas. This one is just sort of playing a pedaling tone. This one is probably the least realistic of all the things that a viola would play because it's kind of a bit much. But I just felt like they needed a bit more oomph to them, so I threw that one in. And then the second viola that we have here. Sort of the start of this like gentle motif that we have going. Next violin we have is doing an octave above that. And the last violin we have is an octave above that. Strings are kind of the OG way of making something sound big, which is just take the part that you have and play it multiple times in different ranges and in different timbres and textures. So if I actually just play these strings by themselves, you can hear all of the major chord information of the song. And then they die down here. In the chorus, they're pretty big, but in the intro, they're pretty sparse. We basically just have the cello and these violas playing something very simple. There's this 4-note walking thing that happens before the vocals come in where it simplifies and then it blows up into everything. It's a beautiful arrangement. Honestly, if you're looking to add indie pop strings to your song, this is a great way to do it, and I would recommend looking at it. From a mixing standpoint, all of these guys just have a little bit of compression on them just to sort of keep them tame, and they all have their own EQ on them just to sort of filter out anything we don't need. Like the violin does not really need anything behind this 1K range because this is like the high violin. Versus this cello, which kind of needs that lower range, otherwise you can't really hear it. But then, yeah, just on the bus, using a little bit of EQ compression, some more Kramer tape, kind of driving them a bit. And then some utility for some gain automation. And then one last gentle element here is this lead line. Just doing this little glide. I believe it's a 4-3-1-6? 4-3-1-5. And I'm just using some Tal Uno, which is basically a Juno. Using some of the Reverb Nation presets and just tweaked it a little bit till it's basically like a pure unaffected waveform, and then just made it kind of soft with attack and release, and then ran into some reverb. On the master, I just have some very simple compression, some more Kramer tape, and for this track, I actually used VSX from Steven Slate. Don't have fully formed opinions on it right now. I'm still kind of testing it out, but so far, I'm enjoying my time with it, and then a little bit of limiting. So let's hear what everything sounds like together. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you enjoyed this kind of stuff, hit subscribe, the bell icon, all that stuff. But yeah, I will see you guys next week.